Welcome back. Well, the Kurdish issue doesn't just affect Turkey, it's a wider regional one. Estimates suggest around 40 million Kurds populate an area around the size of France. But the Kurdish ethnic group straddles 4 borders in the Middle East. Ethnic Kurds compose around 10% of Iran and Syria's populations and 15% of the Iraqi population. Meanwhile, in Turkey, the Kurdish minority could be as much as 28%. That's over 20 million people. Well, last week, on a visit to Turkey, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad expressed solidarity with Turkey's moves against Kurdish fighters in Iraq.
On this issue, from what I've heard from the President during the discussions we've held together, it's very clear that Turkey doesn't have any interests in Iraq. Turkey simply wants to defend itself, and that is its right.
Well, joining us again, our guest from Duhok in Iraqi Kurdistan, Fahad Amin Atroshi, lecturer at the College of Law and Politics at the University of Duhok. From Ankara, Haldun Solmazturk, a retired brigadier general in the Turkish army. And in Doha, Scott Bates, vice president of the Centre for National Policy. Scott Bates, let me start with you for this part of the show. I mean, the US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice will meet Turkish leaders in Ankara next week. What's the message from Washington, do you think?
Well, I think the message has got to be that we understand that your troops have been under attack, but the best way to confront this threat from across the Iraqi border is to not do a major land invasion that will just turn up the heat and radicalize a population in northern Iraq and exacerbate the Kurdish problem. So really cooler heads have to prevail, and I think that's going to be the message from Washington, and that's the message Washington has delivered to the Iraqis as well.
Haldun Solmazturk in Ankara, the US seems to be standing by Turkey, obviously because Washington doesn't want to lose Turkey's support for the US war in Iraq. I mean, how much is Washington caught in the middle, do you think, between Baghdad and Ankara?
Actually, it's extremely important. Everybody accepts the fact that something has to be done, and bearing in mind the immense pressure on the part of the Turkish public opinion, whatever will be done has to be done soon and in a way that would satisfy the Turkish people. So both the Turkish government and the army are under immense pressure. So it's a very, very, very difficult situation in which US involvement and active participation in arriving at an acceptable, applicable, reasonable solution is of paramount importance, I believe.
Fahad Atroshi in Duhok, many critics point out that the US has criticized the PKK who attacked Turkey from northern Iraq, but Washington has failed to get their Kurdish allies in northern Iraq to act against the PKK. What do you make of that?
Actually, we have acted against PKK, as I told you before, that long time ago, years ago, PKK have fought KDP and PUK and Kurdistan Regional Government, and they have attacked many institutions over here in this city, which I'm now talking to you from it, which is Duhok city. The PKK tried to overcome this city, and in many other places in Kurdistan region. But what I'm saying here, and what the Kurdish politicians and Kurdistan regional government is saying, that nothing can be solved by war. The only way to solve this problem is a peaceful solution. The PKK, I think, PKK is representing maybe a segment of the Kurdish people, as you said in the beginning, in Turkey, which is around 20 to 25 million people are living there. But we must not forget that there is a Kurdish problem in Turkey, and this problem has to be solved within the Turkish border and by Turkish government and by the Turkish parliament, because millions of people are not having their cultural rights, political rights, economic rights, and as you know that Kurdistan of Turkey, or the region which Kurdish are populated in Turkey, is very underdeveloped, and people are in lack of the very basic needs of the human beings. So I think this problem should be solved by the Turkish government, because PKK is a reaction, and we do not believe in violence. We have nothing to do as Kurds in Kurdistan of Iraq, the northern part of Iraq. We have nothing to do with the PKK problem. It's a Turkish problem. We don't want to be involved. We believe in friendly relations with Turkey, with other countries, neighboring countries, with Iraq, and we believe that we have a responsibility towards the Iraqi government and the Iraqi constitution, which forbid any attack from the Iraqi soil against any other country in the region, whether Turkey or any other country.
Scott Bates in Doha, General David Petraeus, the top US soldier in Iraq, I presume would want to paint a picture of an Iraq where levels of violence are falling. So a Turkish invasion on his northern flank is the last thing he wants.
You know, this is a nightmare scenario for America in Iraq because the only thing going right was in Kurdistan. Relatively little violence. The U.S. did not have to commit any kind of significant troop level up there, and we've been able to rely on the Peshmerga forces to go into Baghdad and other parts in the Sunni Triangle. So, yeah, from an American perspective, any kind of violent flare up there is absolutely a setback in the effort to have a stable Iraq.
Scott, let me stay with you for a second and just widen this out a little bit. I mean, how significant is the influence of other countries like Syria and Iran? I mean, Syria has its own problems with its Kurdish minority, and President Bashar, as we saw there, is backing Ankara.
Well, you know, this could be an opportunity for the United States to essentially be a good neighbor in the region and try to broker a bit of a deal between the Turks and the Iraqis on this. And ideally, what I'd like to see is why not have joint security teams of Iraqi Peshmerga, Turks and American military forces up in Kurdistan. For the Turks to be successful, they need on-the-ground intelligence, and they can get that by cooperating with the Iraqis. They could use the high tech of American troops and their own toughness together. That could be more than enough to defeat the PKK.
Farhad Atroshi in Duhok. I mean, how much influence do neighboring countries like Syria and Iran have on this crisis? Because the PKK leader, Abdullah Öcalan, said at his trial 8 years ago that the PKK got support from Iran.
I don't think that any neighboring country nowadays is supporting PKK. But as you know, that guerrilla wars and fighters always will find a shelter and a place and somebody to support and sponsor them. So it's not easy. The Kurds in Iraq were fighting the Iraqi government for several years, for more than 5 to 6 decades or more than 60 years. They were fighting the Iraqi government. Sometimes, yes, supported and sponsored by the neighboring countries, but most of the times they were not sponsored by anybody, but they were still fighting. So the PKK, they are an ideological party. They will fight whenever they find an opportunity, but we condemn, we as Kurdish living in Kurdistan of Iraq, we condemn all terrorist acts against any neighboring countries and from anyone, whether from PKK or any other party or even from the neighboring states, against anybody. Because we were suffering from terrorism in 1990s, even in 2003 we were suffering from the Islamic militants in northern Iraq and in Kurdistan region, specifically in Suleymaniye Governorate, and maybe you are aware of that.
Haldan Solmaz Turk in Ankara. Scott Bates was suggesting that probably one of the best ways to tackle this would be to have joint military operations between the Iraqis and the Turkish army inside northern Iraq to chase down the PKK. Is that something that militarily would work on the ground, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think, first of all, we need to differentiate between the PKK terrorist organization and the Kurdish people. I mean, those Kurds living in northern Iraq and Turkish citizens of Kurdish origin. The 30,000 people who lost their lives for the last quarter of a century were mostly of Kurdish origin. I mean, PKK, in the hands of PKK, suffered not only the Turks but also Kurds. But yet, it would be too much to expect a proper military cooperation or a joint military action against PKK in northern Iraq. Everybody understands that there is a limit what Kurdish groups in northern Iraq can do and cannot do. I think what's most expected is to do their best in a sincere way to assist Turkish operations, I think.
Let me just get a final thought from Scott Bates here in Doha. I mean, Scott, do you see this crisis deepening? Is there a quick way around this? Can the diplomacy work?
You know, I don't think there's a quick way around it. It's a steady engagement between all parties and a lot of serious talk getting back from the brink. I think all parties concerned, the Iraqis, the Americans, and the Turks are going to take a deep, hard look at this and say we don't want to push this any farther than it's been. And I think if the Turkish military and leadership really search their soul, they're going to realize that lashing out with a big land invasion is not going to do much good.
OK, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Scott Bates in Doha, Fahad Atrashi in Duhok, and Haldun Solmaz-Turk in Ankara. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and, of course, your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.